Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Oxford University Scientific Society talk of the year. My name is Anka, and I am the current president of OUSS. As you can see, we've moved everything to an online system for this term, but don't worry, we will still be providing some very interesting talks. Our speaker today is Dr. Anders Sandberg. Anders is a James Martin Fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on the ethical issues around human enhancement, such as enhancement of cognition, neuroethics, and cognitive biases. His paper, Ethics of Brain Emulations, became one of the most downloaded papers in the Journal of Experimental and Theoretical Artificial Intelligence. If you have any questions for Anders during the talk, please feel free to ask them in the comments below, and we will read them out for you at the end. Thank you very much for coming. Anders, I will now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Anka. Well, it's a delight to be here in some sense. Thinking about giving a talk for the Science Society, my problem is I'm interested in everything. So I gave Anka a long laundry list of possible topics, and she wisely selected a vast topic that allows me to talk about almost anything anyway. So today it's going to be about the space of possible minds. So the story of this talk is partially that last year I was giving a talk at a science fiction convention at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. So I was trying to come up with something in my research that was linking up to science fiction. That was not very hard because I do a lot of research about the long-term future of humanity, and a lot of that lends itself very well for science fiction. I'm also, technically speaking, part of the philosophy department, and of course science always makes its way in here. But there is another reason I'm interested in thinking about the space of possible minds, and that is much of the research we do at the Future Humanity Institute is linked to issues about artificial intelligence safety. Can you construct artificial intelligence that is both powerful enough to do important things in the world, yet safe enough that we would like to let them deal with that? So I had started thinking about that together with a friend of mine who might be listening in, Peter Eckersley, and we have been tinkering with a paper about the space of possible minds. So through a various roundabout ways, we arrived at this talk. The first question might be, of course, what are minds really? There is this old joke, what is mind? It doesn't matter. What is matter? Never mind. And besides being a fun pun and an example of a poetic chiasm, it's also actually a pretty good philosophical intro to a rather fundamental problem that has been annoying philosophers for a long while. So we have an awareness, we have an inner experience, and we're able to remember things, we can think about things. We certainly have a lot of stuff going on inside ourselves. And then we want to relate that to the outside world. And at this point, many philosophers would already say, wait a minute, how do we even know there is an outside world? Maybe it's all in our mind. And idealists and solipsists would go far and say, yeah, actually, the only thing that exists is thoughts. And the solipsists, or rather me as a solipsist, would say, the only thing that's going on is in my mind. But I think most of us, most of the time, don't believe in that. Most of us tend to think that there is an external world. And then we get to this annoying question of how does information from that external world enter our minds? And this has been a deep philosophical headache for a long while. Even the issue of what a headache is in many ways a very weird thing, because you can't experience my headache, yet it might be a fact. I can fix it by taking the right kind of painkiller. And that painkiller, we know roughly how it affects the nervous system and it affects my brain. So certainly brains seem to be very important for minds. And quite often when we do our everyday talking about mental stuff, we tend to mix this up. We're very loose. We say, oh, I got something into my brain. That doesn't mean that physically some object has entered my brain. And even if there is a change in the information patterns in my brain, that's not necessarily given that that is a part of my mind. As Freud and others pointed out, there's actually quite a lot of stuff going on mentally that we're not conscious of. So there might be levels of our mind that we don't have full access to. There are also good questions about how the mind binds to the brain. So René Descartes famously suggested a dualist theology that said that the body and actually the brain are basically machines. He was thinking about pneumatic control. And then there is the spirit, the soul, existing in some otherworldly realm and interacting with the brain through the pineal gland. His motivation for this was that everything else in the brain seems to be pairwise, but the pineal gland is the one thing that there is only one copy of, so that's singled out and that's a likely point of interaction. Most of us would be happily laughing about that today, but the problem of actually how minds relate to brains is keeping philosophers up at night writing papers and books, and there are many interesting issues there. I'm going to slightly try to dodge the question. I'm going to take a fairly functionalist approach to this and say what we're really interested in is what we can do with minds. And of course, one important question is, how can we think about other minds? This is again a classic philosophy problem. How do we actually know there are other minds? Well, I can certainly talk to people and they talk back at me, but the solipsist might say, yeah, maybe I'm just hallucinating. And maybe other people are just robots. Maybe they're a little bit like the classic program Eliza, the first chatbot, that took what you said, looks through a table trying to find a string that matches what you said, and then gives a canned response back. If you do this well enough, it's shockingly good at eliciting fairly sophisticated conversations, even though you might even know yourself, because you wrote your copy of the program, that you're actually talking to a mirror or a wall. In fact, it seems like we have a tendency as humans to ascribe minds to many things that don't have minds. One interesting observation is that a fair number of people apologize to chairs they bump into. And some, of course, get angry at the chair that they bumped into. This is slightly weird when you think about it, because we generally understand chairs to be mindless. They're inert objects. They're not normally doing very much. Yet, what is going on here might very well be that our brains or minds have evolved to handle things in terms of agents. Because if you're an animal on Earth's surface and you're moving around, trying to find your way, trying to avoid getting eaten, trying to find a conspecific to mate with, it's very useful to have effective ways of modeling other agents. So presumably, just as we have edge detectors in our visual system to find edges in a visual field and higher order detectors for salient things like snakes, it might very well be that we have agency detectors. And they are quite useful, not just for finding actual agents, but you might even apply them to non-agents. It's a bit like, in evolutionary biology, we call this exaptation. Something has evolved for one reason, but it can then get used for something else. Our lungs started out as partially swim bladders in our ancestors, and then because of a series of genetic happenstances, ended up being lungs instead. But if you look at the genetic control programs, you can kind of find that that's where we started out. And because of that genetic history, that's also why our lungs are attached to our throat and why we're both eating and breathing through the same hole, which is a very stupid solution when you think about all the people who are choked. Similarly, it might very well be, this is an interesting hypothesis in evolutionary psychology, that we're using our agency detector and a good skill at modeling agents with different intentions to explain things, not just that are due to other people or animals, but even things like fire. We can understand fire as a kind of creature that wants certain things. It wants combustible material. It also has a tendency to hurt you if you try to touch it. And we might be doing a lot of intuitive physics by using these agency models. This might just be why when the lightning strikes, we jump because it was a sudden shocking signal, that we think somebody was angry. Because normally in a human circumstances, if somebody shouts loudly, that's a signal that somebody wants our attention very strongly and usually not in a good way. So this is an interesting hypothesis in the evolutionary anthropology of religion, how we started ascribing various intentions to natural phenomena and started inventing various spirits and divinities. But it might also be the way we're handling the problem of other minds. We're just ascribing it to an awful lot of other things until we get evidence to the contrary. And much of the time, of course, it doesn't matter very much that we accidentally apologize to our chair when we hit it. But sometimes, of course, this leads to weird conclusions. Still, when we look at fiction, we get into other interesting possibilities. So Greg Egan is a science fiction author that I'm very, very fond of. And he has several interesting stories about what happens when we use neuroscience and advanced technology to tear down some of these borders between minds. When I'm looking at this slide right now, I realize that I forgot for also his short story, The Tap, which is also quite relevant. Now, one of them is particularly interesting in this regard, and that's his short story, Closer. It's set somewhere in the future. Humanity has become very advanced. People have basically mastered their own neuroscience and exist in some sense as software, although they're embodied. And the protagonist really, really wants to know other people. He feels isolated and he wants to really know how other people think. So he was looking into literature, and the protagonist feels like, okay, do I really know here what the author is intending? I'm certainly reading a text that an author generated. But maybe that is just because he is from the same culture as the author. Maybe it's an author from another culture, but there's still a lot of human universals. And of course, quite often you find that unthinking software can fool you. So when Greg Egan wrote this in 91, the software was not half as good as it's today. If you read some of the text generated by GPT-3 today, you will find that they can make very good pastiches of different styles. Yet there is nobody at home. It's not thinking. It's not really doing anything but reflecting the sum total of culture that you have fed the big neural network. And then it's reflecting back at you in a way that seems to imply that somebody is communicating. So the problem here for the protagonist is that literature doesn't actually prove anything about that authors are conscious beings. Now, in the story, this posthuman is in a marriage and they're doing a neuroscientific experiment of actually getting to know each other. So the protagonist and his spouse, although gender gets slightly weird because they switch gender throughout the story and when they're switching bodies, are actually trying to get closer to each other. And I'm not telling you how that goes, but it's an interesting story about the problem that when you tear down the walls between minds, you might get results that you actually didn't intend or didn't want to. There might actually be a lot of advantages in not knowing other minds. Partially, it might be that, well, maybe I don't really want to know how my favorite author was thinking when he or she wrote my text, the text I'm enjoying. Because maybe the meanings actually are different. Maybe they hold views that I actually find repugnant. But there might also be benefits in not knowing all details. I don't really want to know all the details of my gastrointestinal tract. I'm very happy to leave that to my autonomous nervous system, which is usually handling that really well. And similarly, there is a lot of mental processes where I probably, me, in the sense of the conscious level of my mind, probably wouldn't benefit very much from knowing about it. And it might even be risky to know too much about it. One very interesting book is The Elephant in the Brain by Robin Hanson and a co-author who I unfortunately just forgot the name of. But it's a brilliant book, and it's about self-deception. And they make the argument that we're doing an enormous amount of self-deception. Most people would just sagely nod and say, yeah, sure, that's well known. But they also make the point that we are missing out on this because it's very useful not to know when you're deceiving yourself. Many of your deceptions are not just for your own consumption, but also, or perhaps mainly, for the consumption of others, which means that what you're doing is very much trying to lie convincing for everybody in the room, including yourself. So being too aware of what's going on in your mind might actually be bad for your ability to function socially. Anyway, another problem is, of course, what about non-human minds? And this is, of course, an area where science fiction has been doing a lot of interesting work. And this is also where I think we can say that computer science, neuroscience, and especially now artificial intelligence is actually pushing philosophers to think in entirely new paths. For a very long time, philosophers tended to think that they knew what minds were like. And the only other non-human minds they really cared about were the minds of God and maybe angels. That already led to some interesting and slightly peculiar ideas. It turns out, for example, that if you do Aristotelian philosophy of mind, you get into trouble with the question, how do we know universal facts? The facts that everybody knows. I certainly know some things that only I know, but there are also things that everybody seems to be born with the knowledge. How does that end up in our minds? And the medieval Islamic scholar Averroes, he suggested that maybe it's because we're actually sharing one level of our minds. The intellect is shared by all humans. There is only one intellect in the entire world. So that is how the universal knowledge is shared by us. We're all a group mind on one level, although then we have local instances of local private knowledge. This ran into a lot of complicated theological debate in the Middle Ages, which I can't and will not try to summarize. But it shows that sometimes philosophers come up with interesting ideas that would make for pretty good science fiction stories. Another relevant problem, of course, shows up much later, and that is when animal ethics starts to become taken seriously. For a long while in philosophy, it was simple. Well, humans matter because humans have souls, and animals don't matter because they don't have souls. Gradually, philosophy refined things, and people started adding disquieting voices like Bentham pointing out, actually, it might not matter that the animals can't speak or reason. What matters is that they can suffer. And if you say that suffering actually matters morally, then we might need to start thinking about what is the state of an animal mind. How much does a dog suffer if you kick it? Immanuel Kant famously argued that actually dogs are not moral agents, so they don't matter morally. But a person who kicks a dog is, of course, a cruel and bad person. And he's kind of making us ashamed of being humans. We should definitely not be kicking dogs. Now, Kant was actually fairly okay with helping animals, but he didn't think they had the moral rights. Bentham and many of the early utilitarians, they started to argue that actually rights might be the wrong word, but they certainly need to give moral respect to animals, because they could suffer. But then again, what about robots? Well, if you think that robots can't possibly suffer, at least if you're taking the suffering-centric view, they're not moral agents. But maybe we can construct robots that suffer. In that case, would that make them moral agents? Even more problematic, as we'll see, we might end up with minds in robots that are really weird and alien. One interesting take on animal minds that you find in fiction is Ursula Le Guin's brilliant little short story, The Author of the Acacia Seeds and Other Extracts from the Journal of Theorylinguistics. So this is in many ways a send-up of an academic journal, a very literary, philosophical journal, looking at poetry from different species of animals in this apparent future where there is some way of decoding the signals. And in particular, the acacia seeds are a set of seeds found in an abandoned ant nest next to a dead ant, and there are these translations of these short poems written on the seeds in the centrales of ants. And in particular, there is one fragment that is quite interesting. The fragment just says, "Eat the eggs, up with the queen." And the author is trying to explain that, well, how do we interpret this? And the story makes the point that we need to think about how the world looks to an ant. To an ant, the surface world is full of danger. Opportunity, yes, but mostly dangerous things that eat ants. Safety is down below. So when you say up with the queen, that would correspond to us humans, perhaps saying down with the queen. In this case, it's a kind of fictional life world of ants writing poetry. And I think it's an interesting example of the problem of how would we actually interpret the life worlds of other animals. Again, to just name drop another famous philosophy paper, we have Nagel's "What is it like to be a bat?" That points out that we have this fundamental problem that we don't have anything like the echolocation of bats. So when we try to think about what it would be like to be a bat, we are totally going to miss the point because we have nothing like that sense. Now, one can respond, of course, like Scott Alexander did by making a very funny song about how Nagel gets bitten by a vampire. And that's the way he can finally turn into a bat and find out what it's like to be a bat. Or we can do like some of my friends in the transhumanist community do, and try to implant magnets or add ultrasound and actually add new senses. And one of the interesting experiences from that transhumanist experimentation is that our brains are way more flexible when it comes to adding new senses than we might normally think. We normally think that we got our standard 5 senses, which actually is not true because it's a vast number of different senses. We have a large number of chemical senses that are not normally named. And indeed, we have proprioception and various other internal senses. The brain is basically having to take in signals of a lot of different formats and seems to be able to adapt to new formats if you plug in the right nerve signals. Indeed, if you put in a magnet under the skin, its motions as a response to magnetic fields seem to actually make the brain learn in some small region of a somatosensory cortex to interpret those signals not as touch, but as a new sense. So it might be possible to actually experience some slightly different life world by adding artificial senses. Still, I think many people would say, yeah, that's just not the full life world. Just giving yourself antennas doesn't mean you know what it's like to be an ant. There is this fundamental difference in how you function if you're living there. Of course, science fiction authors go much further and say, yeah, but animals, they're so normal. What about really, really different minds? And of course, here we can all start listing our favorite science fiction stories and think about different ways they might function. So, for example, Tim Powers' Declare, which is an excellent spy novel, but there, the jinn, these beings, they have no difference between thinking and doing. And I think it's a very useful example of something we normally always regard as separate. I can think something, but I can also stop myself from doing it. However, the jinn have no such separation, which leads to various very important events in the plot. It also makes them very dangerous to be around. And indeed, some people do not have inhibitions. Some people's frontal lobes don't stop them from doing stuff. So in this case, we can at least experience that lack of separation by being sufficiently drunk or in some other state. But you also have other famous examples. Stanislaw Lem Solaris, for example, the titular planet Solaris has an ocean that seems to be making shapes and doing things. It's very unclear whether this is a mind. And indeed, one of the main points of the entire novel is we don't know what this is. It might not even fit into the category of life, intelligence, or a mind. And indeed, the human inability to handle this is what's actually driving the plot forward, because the humans are fumbling around. Again, there is a hilarious chapter, if you're academically inclined, that is just a send-up of the entire academic literature about this alien planet. Another really disturbing idea shows up in Peter Watt's novel Blind Sight. Again, a brilliant look at different ways minds could work. The human crew of the spaceship Theseus is already pretty weird. The protagonist is merely a high-functioning autist with half of his brain replaced with electronics linked up to artificial intelligence. And he's kind of the most normal person on board. There they encounter alien beings and end up in a situation, without giving away too much, where the alienness might even mean that our category of ascribing a mind to the alien is problematic. In the sequel or parallel quell, Ecopraxia, there are similar questions about post-human group intelligences. People who have modified their brains to link up to each other to such a degree that it's very unclear what's going on. Are they human? Are they even thinking? Or are we just interpreting very random actions as clever things because we happen to have agency detectors? Another problem that's even worse for science fiction authors is the problem of smart minds. So this, of course, always shows up when you're trying to write a mystery novel and you want a really good villain. But it gets even harder if you're a science fiction author and you want to have a super genius or a super AI. So the main author who's been thinking deeply about this is, of course, Vernor Vinge, who already in the 80s started to realize that many of his stories that involved intelligence amplification of various kinds were extremely hard for him to write. So he started looking for ways around this in a literary sense. You can, for example, talk about children who are, and now you, a smart author, just describe a very smart child, and then you can imagine that as that child grows up, it's going to become much smarter. Or you can look at enhanced animals, like in his short story, Run, Bookworm Run, where an uplifted chimpanzee with links to a supercomputer is doing a lot of smart things, but is still also very much a frightened chimpanzee. But generally, he realized that it's exceedingly hard to write about smarter minds, which actually led him to come up with a modern version of technological singularity. He coined that word because he realized that if we get intelligence amplification, we are going to get more intelligence in the future, which is going to apply at least somewhat to intelligence amplification, which from a literary standpoint means that he had no idea what to write about. And of course, if we take this as a prediction about the future, also indicates that the future might be much brighter and much weirder than we would like or can think well about. Now, one interesting thing about this is, of course, trying to get around it in useful ways. You can call in a lot of bright friends and have a committee help you come up with what your smart characters do. Or you can, like Elias Yudkowsky wrote in his text about writing very smart characters, try to model the process of intelligence and set up things so in the story they manage to solve things that you on the fly would have to be very smart to solve. But of course, you as an author can set up the constraints to make an intelligent person. The really interesting issue here is, of course, we want to apply this when we start thinking about artificial intelligence that might get better than us. But of course, it might also show up if we think about human enhancement. So when we talk about post-humanities, one way of doing it is, of course, to just talk post-human, saying, oh, the Anthropocene is going to be over any millennium now, and then there are no humans, and that's very simple to reason about. But another possibility that many critics of transhumanism bring up is, of course, yeah, people are going to enhance themselves, or rather they think they improve themselves, but then they might lose a key trait. Francis Fukuyama, for example, in his book, Our Post-Human Future, argued that this drive towards enhancement is going to both lead to disenhancement, but also that maybe we lose a key trait that makes us human. Now, he doesn't actually do a very careful job of explaining what this trait is, because he's basically throwing every argument towards the wall to try to see if something sticks, to get the reader to agree with him, but this looks like a bad approach. So many of the arguments are not terribly good, but deep down he argues that there is this factor X that makes us human, and if we accidentally or deliberately remove that, then we have lost everything. Now, the problem here is, of course, that factor X might be our changeability. It might actually be more like an overall pattern or a continuity through time rather than having a particular property. Many people who start thinking about human enhancement would instead go for what I would call mild posthumanity. We might dream about using technology and social science to build a world that is like living like a Greek god. We're not aging anymore. We're all looking as beautiful and young as we want, as long as we want. We can fly, and we can generally live a world of endless luxury. The good news is, this is a separate talk, but I actually think this is physically totally doable. It's going to take a lot of hard work before we're there, but I think it's actually totally doable. In fact, I think we can do much better than the Greek gods, because they were basically a reality soap running on Mount Olympus. I think we can actually enhance our emotions. I think we can actually get various forms of well-being that are fundamentally beyond what we currently can experience. We might also think about uploading ourselves into computers, which is another talk entirely, of course, about whether that is feasible and what philosophical and technological assumptions need to be true for that to work. But again, you can imagine living a digital life in a world where you could get whatever you want virtually. And of course, if you can get backup copies, and you can transport yourself to Mars by just sending yourself as a mail and then downloading a suitable body on Mars. And indeed, you might exist in multiple copies. And at this point, of course, the possibilities start going well beyond Mount Olympus. In fact, now we get into a lot of interesting possibility of really enhancing beyond what we normally think of as humans. So we might think about changing, for example, our bodies. Our cognition seems to be quite embodied, but it also seems that if we were to add extra limbs or modify how our bodies function, up to a point, our normal neural networks could adapt to it. And of course, if we made it more flexible, we might be able to plug in new modules, allowing us to use our octopus tentacles or whatever. We might also think about new mental architectures, like actually linking our minds. And we might change human universals, those things that are actually true for all of us right now, but we might then want to invent entirely new ones. And of course, one can go in a lot of very different directions here, as well as including, of course, non-human entities and hybrids with these non-human entities, whether they're artificial intelligences or animals that we enhanced in various ways, or just something that we evolved in the computers. So these possibilities look very big and vast. Now, one interesting question is whether it's even good to go down this route. So I don't agree with Fukuyama's argument that we might lose factor X that makes us human. But there might be other things that we lose or gain along the way. It's less clear that there is a value in getting something that has no value to us right now. I think a good way of reasoning about this is actually thinking about the world of apes. So let us imagine some fictional apes some millions of years ago thinking about becoming post-apes. They value things like sex and bananas, and they're considering, so if we evolved to become super smart, what would happen? And a wise ape would say, yeah, we would, of course, be able to get a lot of bananas that way. Yeah, that seems reasonable. So we have become super apes. It's just that besides sex and bananas, we also like philosophy and art and a lot of things that the monkeys and apes can't imagine. You can't explain philosophy to a chimpanzee because it cannot imagine that. It's a category that's entirely outside chimpanzee worlds. Yet we would say the world is actually much better. We have philosophy, we have art, we have science, we have religions and culture, and yes, indeed, a lot of bananas. The chimpanzees might say, yeah, you humans seems to have succeeded, but actually you're kind of weak on the banana front. You can get a lot of bananas. Why aren't you getting more bananas? And our response would be, well, actually, there are better things than bananas, but you don't appreciate them. You would if you were us, but you cannot be a human. And we might, of course, think about posthumans in the same way. It might very well be that posthumans can indeed enjoy a good banana and a good philosophical argument, but they are going to have an even vaster set of things that they value. Things that we cannot value simply because we can't imagine them having value. But the posthumans would say, yeah, these things actually are really important. Indeed, it's a very unclear how long this chain can continue. And some people would say, actually, maybe there is a kind of plateau. We humans have reached a universal level of thinking, and beyond that, there is actually no new things. That is a possible hypothesis, but we need to explore that. It seems like we actually need to explore that space of possible post-human modes of thinking to see if there is actually no good things there. It's a bit like my friend Todd Huffman, who got an implanted magnet. And one reason was simply, what is there? How does it feel to feel magnetic fields? And I usually ask him, have you found any beautiful magnetic fields? Because I think there are these unexpected things that you cannot discover without having somebody just going exploring. We can't just deduce a priori by sitting in our armchairs that there are these better things. Just like the chimpanzees cannot deduce that there must be something called art and philosophy. They simply cannot bring themselves to think about that. Now, the problem with artificial minds might, on the other hand, be that they can behave in ways we don't like. So I earlier mentioned the idea of self-improving intelligence, and it's sometimes called the intelligence explosion because of a term coined by I.J. Good, a co-worker with Alan Turing and later a pioneer in artificial intelligence. He was the first one to point out that you could make machines that could do everything humans can do, including make better machines, and that ought to lead to a very rapid takeoff. Now, you don't need to believe that is possible. After all, this is an interesting open question. To think that we could have a problem if we get very powerful machines. Because when you have a goal, like playing chess or colonizing the universe, you also develop in sub-goals. In order to win at chess, you presumably need to maneuver your pieces, so you put the enemy king into check. If you want to settle the universe, you need to build rockets, and then you get the sub-goal of acquiring materials for those rockets. And you might need to get data about where the orbits of various planetary orbits are, and then you need to acquire information about that, etc. So let's produce sub-goals. They are instrumental for your actual goal. But many of these sub-goals might be convergent. So this is a hypothesis that was first espoused by Omohundro and then later popularized by Nick Bostrom and Yudkowsky. There are many things that are practical for practically every goal, like having more computing power or making sure nobody changes your goal. Because if your goal is winning at chess and somebody threatens to reprogram you into a checkers playing machine, then you're going to win at less chess. So at least up until the point when you get reprogrammed, you actually have a good reason to try to avoid getting your goals changed. This is also a good reason not to get destroyed. Certainly, you might not start out by giving the chess-playing robot a self-preservation instinct. But if it's smart enough to think about its situation, it's going to realize that if somebody pulls the plug, less chess is going to get played. I need to protect that plug. Now, depending on the architecture, this might lead to all sorts of weird behaviors, including a very dangerous chess-playing machine that tries to protect its integrity and make sure no human ever reprograms it. Now, if it's a very powerful machine, which might not be true for the chess player, but might be true for an infrastructure we build to settle the universe, that might mean that it actually changes the world in ways that could be very dangerous for us humans. So the standard toy example is the paperclip maximizer that is told to maximize the number of paperclips. And of course, it then tries to convert the entire world into paperclips. And even if it understands that humans don't like that, it's still going to try, and indeed, with that understanding, it's going to have the instrumental goal of stopping humans from turning them into paperclips. So this shows that powerful intelligence might be misbehaving in very subtle ways. Another problem is that in humans, there is certainly some correlation between understanding morality and having sensible goals and intelligence. a lot of evil acts are simply because of laziness and stupidity. There are certainly high functioning sociopaths that realize that, yeah, I want this and the others want that, and I might break the rules. But when it comes to pure artificial intelligence, you can basically set any goal and combine that with any level of intelligence, with some theoretical constraints that are pretty mild. And this is, of course, rather disturbing, because then you might end up with powerful, intelligent agents that have very crazy goals. And again, most people would say, yeah, but don't program a dangerous agent. At that point, of course, most of us programmers get a bit guilty, because we have, of course, done a lot of slip-ups where we put some things into the code and we thought, I'm going to fix that before this program ships, and then realize, oops, I slipped up. The bug is in the production code. It's fairly likely that we make mistakes. And this gets particularly tricky because human values are fragile and complex. People have been spending thousands of years trying to define what the good and the beautiful is. And quite often when you try to make a list of what the good things in life is, somebody raises their hand at the philosophy seminar and gives a beautiful counterexample showing that this fulfills all the laundry list you have given, but totally produces a dystopia. It's very easy to get all that you asked for, but none of the substance. Yes, we humans want to be happy, but being permanently on a heroin drip with a lobotomy, yeah, you might be happy, but it's not a good human life. So we might say you want to act, you want to do meaningful things. But again, Nozick shows up with his experience machine thought example and say, yeah, you could do this in virtual reality. Okay, so the acting and sense of meaningfulness doesn't meet the criteria. Oh, okay, I want to act in the real world. And so on and so on. It seems like quite often, if we even leave out one small thing, we quite often end up with a bad situation. And this is, of course, problematic if we think that we're going to move to a world with more and more powerful artificial minds or artificial functional systems, because we are putting in values and goals in them. And they might indeed have various forms of convergence and amplify themselves because of intelligence explosions or just because they're powerful systems from start. And then we might end up with a bad situation. So much motivation here has gone into thinking about the space of possible minds have been, how do we make safe artificial intelligence? Of course, some critics, like Eric Drexler, would point out that actually quite a lot of your examples, Anders, were a little bit like the robot or the AI sitting in a server farm somewhere. It's an individual being. We might actually end up with superintelligence as a service. So in his paper about reframing superintelligence, he points out that another way of getting it is actually comprehensive AI services. Basically, you have the Amazon cloud where you that contains the ability to generate intelligent abilities in various narrow domains. You plug them in to generate the applications and solve your problems, but there is nobody there. It's just like the Google search engine. It's in some sense self-aware because it does have searched across web pages that refer to it, and it has even searched its own web pages. But it doesn't want anything. It doesn't do any action on its own. It functions in a very different way from the robot that you might imagine rebelling against its owners. So, what does that mean? Well, we need to think about the space of possible minds. And this little diagram, I think originally sketched out by Eliezer Yudkowsky, makes one claim about it. There are the human minds in that small corner down there at the bottom, and then we might expand that by enhancing ourselves and making ourselves much smarter, and we reach that red thing. And then we might enhance ourselves in all sorts of weird directions to reach a much bigger part. But out there are going to be other forms of artificial minds that might actually be fundamentally different from us, and they might be potentially so weird and different that just making a random mind means that we might end up with something inhuman and hence quite dangerous and risky to deal with if it's too powerful. So that's one possible view. The argument is basically that evolution gave us this kind of mind, but it could have gone differently, and we're just in this vast space. Another view that's actually supported by some recent results in machine learning suggests that actually maybe we are making up a larger part of mind space than we think. Because what is a human brain? In some sense, it's a generic learning and optimization system. We are moving around the world. From the start, we don't even really know that much about our bodies, but the brain actually adapts to our bodies and senses and builds a body model and sense model. We have a lot of rather specific, so to say, pre-packaged software that helps us bootstrap in the world. But then we function as a high-dimensional optimization system. And like in the paper by Afras, they demonstrated that if you do convolutional networks that look at pictures, they actually can predict a lot of variation that you find also in the visual cortex. This is interesting because these neural networks were very vaguely inspired by the visual cortex, but have gone through a long period of development in the world of technology that made them very non-biological. They're in many ways totally dissimilar to what you find in the monkey brain. Yet it seems like they seem to converge on a way of recognizing structures that actually is not terribly different from what you find in monkeys. The earliest layers, for example, show edge detectors that are actually quite similar to what you find in the V1, the first the primary visual cortex. And the more high-level systems indeed do so show some similarities. Another interesting example is the paper by Draxler that demonstrates that if you train neural networks in some domains, they quite often find very, very different solutions to the problem that minimize the energy, which in this case corresponds to error. And if you interpolate between two solutions, you typically find that, okay, that doesn't work. But it turns out that actually these low error states, they lie along many dimensional manifolds. That is, actually there's quite a lot of different ways of solving whatever problem the neural network is supposed to solve. But they're all more or less the same. This might sound totally outrageously weird, but it actually follows a little bit from what we know about multidimensional geometry and the behavior of random functions across such spaces. So maybe it turns out that actually most minds are somewhat similar. So Arnold Sloman, in a very influential paper in 1984, he suggested that maybe we should explore this along different dimensions. So he suggested a lot of dimensions that were enough to fill a paper and inspire a lot of people. And he still noted that this is kind of woefully inadequate. And I hope future papers will expand on it. And relatively few papers have actually dared to do that. But he points out that there are many different ways of building up minds. There's internal process that might be continuous, like activities in neural networks, or maybe very discrete operations, like in good old-fashioned AI that was thinking about logic. You might also have interesting things like, are they thinking in terms of a sequence, or is everything going on in parallel? How are they connected to the external environment? Are they capable of modeling others or not capable? And this is an interesting example if we go back to my original example of agency detectors and apologizing to my office chair. Some of us have a higher degree of modeling of others than others. I'm myself only scoring mildly on the autism spectrum, but I certainly can kind of recognize that inability to figure out how other people think, especially when I'm losing against them in various games. Sometimes other minds are totally mysterious. And moving along that scale, I can totally imagine a mind that cannot model other minds. Similarly, what about logical inference? Well, many of us living in an academic world, we're very good at doing that. And we have internalized various rules on how you can do logical conclusions. But many people haven't gone that formal route and actually are not very logical in the formal sense. They might still be making good inferences, but they're doing it using analogies instead. Anyway, the interesting thing about these ones is that many of them are quite relevant for making safe AI. You probably really want to make sure that your AI system recognizes that certain entities in the world are so-called people. and people you need to be careful with. Then the definition of people might actually be kind of fussy. So maybe we're going to be apologizing to shoproom dummies and photos on the wall too. But it's better safe than sorry. You might want to think about the goal consistency. Does the system have a fixed goal like paperclips, or could it actually change them? Could it generate new motives and indeed new ways of generating motives? And of course, important things like how aware should it be of itself? I was mentioning at the start that I've been working on a paper with Peter Eckersley, and we're doing our own attempt at thinking about it. So here is just the list of our own dimensions that we have been thinking. You will notice a fair bit of overlap with Sloman's list, but it's also not complete. I think the really important conclusion here has been so far that it looks like many of these traits do seem to be uncorrelated. You can actually have a significant diversity that really matters. Take, for example, something like a life cycle. Humans right now have a fairly simple life cycle. We come into being, we grow up as infants, we gradually develop a mind. That mind lives through a life, it changes a bit, and eventually we die. That can be changed. If you're a piece of software, after all, you might come into being, and once you're functioning well enough, now 1 million copies of you get sent out across the world. They might be evolving in a divergent way, and maybe it's also possible to merge some of them together, and you might get patches and upgrades and eventually become obsolete, but still show up at the History of Computing Museum. Or you might become a part of another system. That seems to allow a life cycle that both morally very different from what we experience, and might also mean that you think in very different ways. Similarly, we have issues like being a collective agent. We humans are mostly unified, at least we like to think so. Of course, our hemispheres generally tend to be correlated, but actually in people with hemispherectomy, where you cut the corpus callosum, it turns out that the two sides of the brain can act fairly independently and even get out of sync, but both of them are good at making up an explanation why they did that. Conversely, by being part of a tightly connected group, humans can sometimes show collective cognition. That might be amplified in various ways. There are interesting experiments by Miguel Nicolelis at Duke University about connecting using neural interfaces the brains of different animals, suggesting that these brain nets can solve problems individuals are less able to solve. I'm hoping somebody is trying to replicate those experiments because it's kind of outrageously cool result and might tell us quite a bit, but it's also kind of technically hard to do. So the important thing here is that compositionality that we take for granted can be probably changed rather profoundly. And of course, proponents of psychedelics would say that most of these things can totally be changed by taking a suitable dose of something sufficiently psychoactive. But the general thing seems to be that it's possible to get significant diversity by just varying some of these factors that is way beyond humanity, even if there is quite a lot of convergent evolution in how you build a visual system or how you solve the problem of maybe detecting agents. And of course, the really deep questions are, what about consciousness? Murray Shanahan has an excellent essay where he was thinking about both human likeness and capacity for consciousness, where he pointed out that there might actually be quite a lot of very strange things out there. He calls it conscious exotica. It's not like humans, but it's very conscious. Indeed, there is a theory, integrated information theory, that proposes one way of quantifying consciousness. And the critic of that, Scott Aronson, pointed out a particular matrix inversion operation by this theory should be supremely conscious. And at that point, you can either say, okay, maybe that's not a good theory for consciousness because stuff I can run in my maths program by pressing a key probably can't get conscious on order. Or you bite the bullet and say, actually, there are superconscious states. It's just that they don't do very much interesting things. Even more intriguingly, it might be that we want to create certain agents that have some degree of human likeness but might be more conscious than us or more human than us. And of course, there are even weirder things out there in mind space. So it turns out that at least Gregory Chaitin has argued that there are mathematical facts that are true for no reason. Basically, you can generalize the Gödel incompleteness theorems to show that there are certain statements in arithmetic that you cannot deduce from much else. They're kind of just there, spuriously. They're just part of the way the system works. And this might apply to mind space. You can actually make minds that are minds just because of accident. So you can imagine, for example, an AI program that every time it tries to think something, it has to solve the collapse problem, which is you take a number, if it's even, you divide it by 2. If it's odd, you multiply it by 3 and add 1. And then keep repeating this until you reach the number 1. It's not known whether this always ends. It seems like it does. But it's very similar to some questions that have been proven to be equivalent to the halting problem in Turing machines, that hence are very similar to the stuff Chaitin is talking about. So you could imagine this AI program. It would tend to do things, and then it might randomly freeze up if it sees the wrong thing. But maybe it doesn't. It's all dependent totally on some random facts of mathematics. So it seems like out there are these spurious minds that just exist because of random chance. It's a bit like what philosophers bring up as the swamp man example, where they imagine lightning hitting a swamp and randomly assembling atoms into a replica of me. That swamp man, is that a continuation of me? And in what sense can we link this to personal identity? Theoretical physicists have similar problems with Boltzmann brains that infest the universe in the very far future, where all matter has dissolved into elementary particles. But random fluctuations cause brains from time to time to form. It's a very low probability event, of course, but if you have infinite time, it's bound to happen. And these brains show up and think a few thoughts before dissolving back into chaos. The problem here to philosophers and physicists is that the majority of brains in the universe will be Boltzmann brains, rather than actual brains living at the springtime of the universe like we think we do. So the mind space seems to be rich and full of very strange things. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to brush past the cosmic minds. Because, of course, some people have been thinking that maybe we can go a lot further. So in science fiction, perhaps the greatest cosmic mind ever is Olaf Stapledon's novel Star Maker, where he describes the history of the universe and all intelligent life trying to become better, to expand, to understand things. And that's the ultimate moment of our universe, where all the individual minds have linked up to group intelligences across the galaxy, and the galactic intelligence link up to a universal intelligence. It kind of realizes that this universe is pretty crappy, it's imperfect, and it's actually going to all go downhill and end up in entropy. But the entity that created the universe is going to make other universes that are better. And in this story, the Star Maker, this entity, is making these ever better universes, not because it's a nice guy, but rather it's aesthetic. It wants to make a perfect universe. And when it finally succeeds in making that perfect universe, it's isomorphic to Star Maker. That's why everything actually exists. It's kind of interesting to notice that another person who was thinking about similar things was Tolkien. And neither of them were that much linked to the Jesuit scholar Taylor de Chardin. Taylor de Chardin was a controversial guy who was trying to unify Catholic thinking and evolutionary biology. And of course, he got sent off by the church to be a missionary in central China because it was kind of slightly embarrassing and heretical, and also not very good evolutionary biology. But his basic idea was, well, we humans might be evolving towards higher states. And these higher states mean that we get connected to each other more strongly through what he called the noosphere. The noosphere is a world of conscious thought, and he would totally have loved the internet because he was basically predicting something like the internet, that we all get gradually more and more connected, and eventually we get unified. And in that final moment, mankind gets unified into what he called the omega point, and that's really, then it joins with God. Now, this is kind of an interesting theory, and it's then been reused in science fiction quite a bit. Indeed, It's also been reused as speculative cosmology by Frank J. Tipler. His omega point theory is literally trying to make an actual physical cosmology based on these ideas. Again, it runs into serious problems because it needs a closed universe, and our universe happens to be open. But it's interesting that this is very similar again to Tolkien's thinking about the divinity of his Middle-earth stories, where Eru Ilúvatar, this divinity, is basically again playing an aesthetic game and making these smaller entities, which are the gods that are playing around in Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings, and they are doing an aesthetic project. And eventually they will learn enough to actually unify and sing the song in perfect unison. And at that point, they will actually become the god itself. These things are a little bit outside the space of possible minds that Peter and me are working on. That's a little bit more ambitious than just making a safe superintelligence. But it's interesting to see that we can learn a lot of things by exploring mind space. Perhaps the first step is just as David Brin pointed out, science fiction has a liberal agenda of making the other, the alien, the animal, a potential friend rather than a foe. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's bad. And actually being able to empathize or understand and think in different ways, we learn something important. It might also be useful for us to actually think about, maybe we need to care about some of these entities. What about those robots? If we make them so they could suffer, maybe we actually need to make sure we either give them virtual painkillers or avoid making them, or give them the right kind of rights. When we encounter aliens, we might want to make sure that we treat them as proper moral patients. And there might be modes of cognition that we currently don't have, but might want to have. By imagining posthumans, we might actually find ways of seeking out valuable forms of minds. And this is a way of extending our imaginations. It's not just empathy, but we actually do extend our minds by thinking about ways of resolving thinking, by trying to solve problems in entirely new ways, or finding ways of outsourcing that to machines if we can't do it with our biological brains. Getting rid of these anthropomorphical illusions, I think, is also very useful. Many of the things I've been bringing up here are really alien and might actually not correspond to anything in reality. But it helps us decide what kind of designs do we want to give the minds we make. Whether that is the upbringing we're giving to our kids, or uplift to the genetically engineered animals, or artificial intelligence we're trying to build. We can think about what is a safe design for an AI, what might be a good design for an AI, what might be a fruitful design for an AI. But there is, of course, always this open-endedness. Maybe there are things that are like minds, but not minds. Once upon a time, the universe didn't contain anything conscious. There was just a lot of matter and energy tumbling around. Then life emerged, and maybe a simple life isn't conscious, but at some point the nervous system or whatever else it takes to become conscious emerged. So there was an era where there didn't exist consciousness. And it might very well be that we're still living in an era like that. Maybe there's something like consciousness prime or mind prime that's just as above a current state as our minds, our consciousness, our intelligence is above the states that existed before life. So the real challenge might be that the universe is really open, and we might not really know where we want to go there unless we evolve towards that. Thank you very much, and hope to hear your questions.
Right. Thank you, Anders, so much for such an interesting talk. We've got quite a few questions for you.
I can imagine.
But I'm afraid we're going to have to keep the answers relatively brief.
Yep.
Just for time reasons, not for personal reasons. So if we could get the first question up, that would be fantastic. Right, so the first question is from Carl S, and it is, what is the difference between GPT-3s and a child's learning of language?
Yeah, I think that is a very cool thing, because a child generally learns by watching people communicate with each other and interact in the world. And philosophers of language have a rather strong opinions that it's very important to see language used in order to learn what's going on. It's sometimes called the Gavagai problem, because if somebody just holds up a rabbit and says Gavagai, you don't know whether he means rabbit or food or a collection of rabbit parts. Meanwhile, GPT-3 doesn't see language used in the normal sense. It just gets a lot of pattern of language and then makes probabilities of what follows from that. So it's fundamentally different. Yet the fact that it can sometimes generate behavior that looks very human-like seems to hint that maybe there is something we don't get in philosophy of language yet that is still very learnable.
Okay. Very interesting. So yeah, and then if we could get the next question. This is a good one. Do you think AIs that are not goal-orientated, say more exploratory, are safer for humans? Also, are these more likely to get trapped into heroin machines, which act like attractors? This is from Guillermo V.
Yeah, so the heroin machines, this is sometimes called wireheading after the experiments where you put electrodes in the motivational system of test animals or sometimes human patients. And that tends to be very rewarding. So they tend to want to get that stimulation. Of course, it's slightly subtle here because it might not just be that it's enjoyable, but it might also be a motivational thing. So every time you get stimulation, you want to get the stimulation rather than enjoying the stimulation.
So they basically almost become like addicted to...
Yeah, this is linked to addiction in a subtle way. If I get a shot of cocaine into my brain, that's probably going to make me both enjoy the experience, at least the first time. But it's also going to activate the wanting system. I'm going to want to have that experience again. And this is going to train my neural network into next time I see white powder, I'm going to be interested in snorting that. The interesting and very sad fact is, of course, that if I were a real cocaine addict, I might actually not enjoy the cocaine that much. I'm no longer getting the liking. I'm still getting the wanting. So every time I see white powder, I'm going to try snorting it. So the problem here for building a machine intelligence is you want a motivation system that has the right structure. You don't want it to wirehead in the wrong way. And exploration is an interesting issue here because you might imagine a system that is not that goal-oriented. It's not aiming at maximizing things. Instead, it's going to try to get as much new information. In many ways, it looks like a good way of getting out of this tendency to over-maximize things. The paper clipper is all about destroying the world in order to maximize the number of paper clips. You can imagine all sorts of failure modes where something over-maximizes things and then ignores all other values. If instead you have a system that's uncertain about the world and tries to explore new things, that looks much safer. Except, of course, that might do quite unsafe explorations. Finding out how humans work, well, you can learn a lot by dissecting humans or annoying humans or just doing weird things to humans and see how they respond. So you still get misbehavior, but a different kind.
So they might almost end up behaving like toddlers or something.
Yeah. Toddlers are interesting because they're very explorative. They want to explore things, their own bodies, their outside world, but they also don't have that much of a conscience. They don't really treat other people as people because they don't know other people exist. They're pure solipsists when they start out. And then they grow up and become merely a bit sociopathic because they still don't care that much about other people. Gradually, when they've been in enough arguments with parents and siblings, they start to realize, oh, these other things behave like me. They also cry when you hit them. And then gradually the mirror neurons start firing and you start perhaps to getting a bit of empathy and compassion, or at least the realization that I better not hit my brother because he's going to hit me back.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think we've got time for one last question, and then I think that will have to be it, I'm afraid. So I'm very sorry to people whose questions we couldn't answer. So this one is from someone called Avi, and he's asking, how much can we learn from non-neurotypical minds? Can it help AI development? One example is Oliver Sacks's book, full of novel thinking he's observed in his patients.
Oh yeah, I love Oliver Sacks' writing in general. The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat is a neuroscience classic, and many of his other books are very helpful I think in particular for us to think about other people, because we tend to think that other people think like we do, except that we don't. And this is very shocking and very surprising. And then it's particularly useful to have a non-neurotypical person, because they're so far away that we're really forced to stretch out our minds to realize that, okay, some people actually like to see the world as prime numbers. Some people actually can't tell the difference between a person and a hat. Now, would this help us program AI? And I think the answer is not directly. I think it's useful to have this flexibility and recognition of that diversity for dealing with humans, because we might become much more passionate when we understand how different we are from each other. And that in turn helps us thinking about, okay, what are we missing here? Maybe we need a bigger and broader committee with more diversity when we try to put in the ethics in the AI. Maybe we need not just somebody who's got autism on this committee, but a staff. Actually, it might be useful to have people who think very differently on the problem, especially if we want to figure out what can we boil down human values to. If there's something both the sociopath and the meditating monk both agree on, then it's probably a good hit.
That's an interesting concept. I've never thought of AI building like that before. But as I said, I'm afraid this is going to have to be the last question for today. Anders, I would like to
For today.
for today, yes. You're always welcome back. Anders, I would like to thank you once again. It was an absolutely brilliant talk, and it was a pleasure to have you at the Oxford University Scientific Society. Thank you for everyone who's joined us today. If you're interested to read or hear more about Anders' research, please check out his webpage and join us for next week's talk with Dr. Pam Berry of Oxford University, who will be talking about the challenges and opportunities of climate change for biodiversity. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Bye-bye. Live long and prosper.